Hello everyone. In the last video, we have completed the basic implementation of the Promise API. In this video, we will try to implement the Promise.race static function. Before going to the actual implementation, let's understand what is Promise.race and when it is used. So this is the MDN documentation for Promise.race, and it says the Promise.race static method takes an iterable of promises as input and returns a single promise. This returned promise settles with the eventual state of the first promise that settles. What that means. So let's understand it by this example. We have two promises here, and the first promise resolves after 500 milliseconds, and the second promise resolves after 100 milliseconds. And we are calling promise.raise with an array of these two promises. So you can see that promise.raise static method takes an iterable of promises. Array is an iterable, so here we are passing an array of these two promises. And it returns a single promise. So this promise.raise function returns a single promise. That's why we are able to call the then method to it. Okay. And what happens when we pass an iterable of promises? So you can see that these two promises are running concurrently, and whichever settles first will be the fulfilled or rejected value of this promise.raise function. Okay. In this example, you can see that promise 2 settles after 100 millisecond, while promise 1 settles after 500 milliseconds. So out of these two, promise 2 settles first. Okay. So in that case, the returned promise settles with the eventual state of the first promise that settles. So here promise 2 settles first, and it is using the resolve function, and the status of the second promise will be fulfilled. So the returned promise from promise race will also be fulfilled after 100 milliseconds. Okay. Now when it is used, it's useful when you want the first async task to complete but do not care about its eventual state. So we have a list of promises and we are using the race method, and all of the promises are running concurrently, and we are only care about the first one that settles, and we do not care about its eventual state. The first one that settles can either be in fulfilled state or rejected state. We do not care about that. We only care about the first one that settles. That's when we use promise.race. Okay. Let's copy this example and let's try more cases. So in the example, it resolves. I mean, out of these two promises, we know that the second promise settles first, and it is using the resolve function. So this will be a fulfilled promise. Because of that, here you can see that we are only passing the first callback to the then method, because this promise.raise will eventually return a promise, and after 100 millisecond, it will be in fulfilled state. So this callback will be executed with the fulfilled value, which is 2. Now let's change this a little bit. Instead of resolve, let's change to reject. So here again, out of these two promises, the second promise settles first, but this time it rejects. So after 100 milliseconds, this promise will be in rejected state. And what happens to the raise function? It also returns a promise, and its status will be also in rejected state after 100 milliseconds. So this callback is not used. So we can use a catch method. You can see that here we received this log because now promise 2 is a rejected promise, so that is the eventual state of promise.raise. Now let's look at a practical case. Let's say we have an API call, and sometimes it takes a longer time. So if it takes a particular, I mean, if it takes longer than expected, we have to basically cancel the operation. So let's write a util function for that. So here you can see that fetch with the timeout receives an API, which is the asynchronous task, and a delay. Okay, and inside it creates a new promise. We are calling it as timeout task, which creates a new promise, and it uses the reject method, and internally it creates a timer using set timeout, and the reject method is called after this delay with the value API timeout. And what we are returning here, we are calling promise.raise, and we are passing an array, and the first item is the timeout task, and the API is also another promise which we get to this function. This is the actual API call, and we are passing the delay. So what is the expected result here? The expected result is, let's say if we are passing a delay of 3 seconds. Okay, so if the delay is 3 seconds, the reject function will be executed with this value after 3 seconds. Now we have this API here, and if the API completes before 3 seconds, this is the first one settles. So the promise.raise function uh, ignores this promise, and it consider only the API. Now let's say if the API still running and it 3 seconds is over. When 3 seconds is over, this reject function will be executed with this one. So this timeout promise will become the first one settled, and this promise.raise method returns a rejected promise with the rejected reason as API timeout. Let's test this. So we have this API. So users, yeah, it creates a promise, and here this resolve function will be executed after 3 seconds with the value completed. Okay, so here, okay, we are calling fetch with timeout, and we are passing the API, and we are passing the delay of 2 seconds. Okay, so fetch with timeout function is called with the API, which is this one, and the delay is 2 seconds. And to the then method, we are passing console.log as on fulfilled and on rejected. Okay, let's see what happens. So you can see that API timeout is executed. What happens here? Here the delay that we are passing is 2 seconds, which means after 2 seconds, this reject function is executed. So before 2 seconds, the API has to complete, right? But our API completes only after 3 seconds. So out of these two, the timeout executes first. The timeout completes first. That's why it rejects. Now let's do again. This time, 2, and let's give 1.5 seconds. So this time the API completes in 1.5 seconds, and the delay is still 2 seconds. Okay, so instead of API, we can give API 2, and let's try it. You can see that this time it is not rejecting, because in 1.5 second, the resolve function is called. So out of these two, API 2 settles first. So this is how the raise method works. Now there are some edge cases and other scenarios that we can do some examples and understand. So what happens if uh, we pass an empty array? Then we can. So this time, the returned promise from promise.raise will always be in pending state. That is one case. So to the raise function, if you pass an empty array, it will be always in pending state. What happens if we are passing a non-iterable value? Let's say we are passing an empty object here. So empty object is not iterable. Okay. Now what happens? Let's execute this. So you can see that the promise is rejected because empty object is not iterable. So this second console log is executed with error, and object is not iterable. Okay, cannot read a property symbol.iterator, which means an object is said to be iterator only if it have a property called symbol.iterator, and its value should be a function. Okay, now let's pass this time another iterator. So string in JavaScript is also an iterable. Okay, now what happens here? You can see that t is printed. Now, when we use its iterator function, I mean, when we loop through this string using for of loop, the first value will be the first character. So that's why this console.log is executed with t, and that's the first one that is settles. Okay, now let's do another example. This time, um, so all this time, this test, and this time we have 1, 2, 3. These are not uh, promises. So even though the description says an iterable of promises as input, it works with non-promise values as well. It need not be promise instances. So here what happens? 1 is the resolved value. So what happens internally when we pass a list of items, and when the items are not promised, instance of promise, it wraps it with the promise class to make it promise. Okay, so internally everything will be converted to promise, and these values will become the fulfilled value of those promises. Okay, let's take one more example here. In this time, so here the first item is a promise because promise.resolve static function returns a promise instance. Second item is again a primitive. Third item is also primitive. So we know that internally it needs to call the then method if it is a promise instance to get the resolved value or rejected reason. We have to call the then method. Now when it comes to these primitive values, it's already the value is already there, so we can directly call the resolve function with this value. If we think that way, here the first one that should be resolved or first one should be completed will be the second item, the 2, because promise.resolve of 1 returns a promise instance, and we have to call the then method, and the callback that we pass to uh, call the then method is executed later. It is first pushed to this microtask queue, and it waits for completing all the synchronous tasks, then only it will be executed. So in that way, we will think that 2 will be the result this time, which means this console.log will be executed with 2. But let's try to see what happens. You can see that still 1 is the returned value. So that's a important detail about this raise function that we have to understand. Here in this past iterable, one item is promised and the other two items are normal primitive value. But even that's the case, internally, these values are converted to promise. Okay. In that case, the first one is completed first. This 2 will also, I mean, the 2 will be converted to promise.resolve. And then again, we have to call the then method to get the 2. The same thing happens with the 3 as well. In that case, the first one to be resolved or fulfilled or settled will be this first item. So that's why we are getting 1. So this is an important detail that we have to understand. Now let's do our implementation of the promise.race. So we have all those static and resolve static method, reject static method, and as instance method, we have then catch and finally already implemented in the last video. So before going to the implementation of the raise function, I have to clarify one thing. So in our last video, we have implemented the resolve static function as it is. Okay, so if you compare this functionality with the original Promise API, there is a small difference. Okay, what we are what we are doing here is that we don't care about the value. We get whatever value it is, and we are creating a new promise, and we are calling the resolve function, and we are passing the value. Okay, so sometimes this value can be an instance of another promise. Okay, this can be a promise instance. In that case also, everything works with this code. But if this is a promised instance, we are unwantedly creating an extra iteration. So what I mean by that is, let's say this is a promise and we are calling resolve function with the promise instance. When what happens? If you go to the resolve function, so this is our resolve function, and this time this is a promise instance. And you know that promise instance have then method, so it will enter in this if condition. Okay, this is a thenable, and it will call the then method of that promise. Even though if it is an immediately resolved or rejected promise, this callback again needs to be pushed to, or this callback again needs to be pushed to the microtask queue, and it runs asynchronously. Okay, then only this resolve or reject function calls and it settles the value. So what I mean is that when we use this function, if the value is already an instance of promise, we don't have to wrap it again with another promise. We can immediately return. Okay, so what we can do here, if value, so what we are doing here is that if the value is already an instance of my promise, just return the value. Don't wrap it with another promise. Okay, so this is the one thing that we missed from the last video, but this is essential. Now let's implement our version of the raise method. Okay, which receives an iterable of promises. which returns a new promise. Let's understand what we are doing here. So we receive a list of promises and we are returning a new promise, and inside we are using the try catch block. Let's understand why we need a try catch block. If this is not a iterable object, then when we execute this for of loop with that iterable, it will throw an error. For of loop will work only with iterables. Okay, if any object that is not iterable, if you try to iterate it using for of loop, it will throw an error. So that's why we need a try catch block here. So if error is thrown, we have to reject. We have to use the reject method with the thrown error as the rejected reason. Now, what are we doing here in this loop? So we are iterating through each of the item and we are calling then method and we are passing the resolve and reject. Resolve will be the on fulfilled value, reject will be the on rejected value, and we don't know what happens to the promise instance. Okay, now this is done with every element in the list. Okay, so one of them will settle first, and whichever settles first, and depending on its final state, either this resolve or reject function will be executed. Okay, now one change that we need here is that sometimes this can be normal primitive value or undefined or null. Okay, now in that case, this won't work because it need not have a then method. So what we can do here, we can wrap it with the resolve function. So if you call the resolve function with the received value, I mean each of the value, then it anyway returns a promise so that we can call the then method. Okay. In our earlier example, we were passing 1, 2, 3, those integers. So in that case, what happens is that it uses this resolve function and it passes that value. So this will eventually return a promise. Okay. This is the implementation of the promise.race method. Now let's test our implementation. So my promise raise. Um, let's pass a non-iterable method. I mean, the empty object is not an iterable. So you can see that promises is not iterable. What happens here is, see this one. This one here is an empty object. So we are trying this for of loop. That's why it's throwing the error because this is not an iterable. So that is working. So here what happens is that to the then method we are passing on fulfilled and on rejected. So the second console log is executed with the thrown error. That's what it is showing here. Okay. Now let's pass a string. Okay. You can see that T is printed. Okay. Now all of these values, I mean, with this iterable TEST, all these characters are not instances of promise, but still it works. Now let's do 1, 2, 3. Now 1 is the result value. Now let's do one more case here. We can change this to MyPromise.resolve and we can pass 1. Okay. This time, like I said, it should return the value 1, even though this is a promise instance and these are not promises. You can see that 1 is returned. Because internally, this 2 and 3 is also wrapped with promise. So eventually we have to call the then method to get this value. And those callbacks that we pass to then method is eventually pushed to the micro task queue and then only executed. So even though this is a promise, it is the first one that completes according to the raise function. Now let's do an actual case. Mm, yeah, let's use this example here and we can change it to our promise class. So instead of new, you can use my promise, and here also my promise, and this becomes my promise. Okay, you can see that after 100 milliseconds, this promise settles with the value 2, and we are getting 2. This is the race method, and we will be looking at other static methods in the coming videos. Thank you for watching.